Archaeologists never expected to find a human-built structure that existed 17,000 years before the pyramids, especially one created during the harsh conditions of the Ice Age. Yet deep inside a limestone cave in Greece, a discovery like this slowly began to emerge. What first looked like nothing more than a random pile of stones soon raised questions no one was ready to answer. There were no carvings, no statues, and no clear signs of known civilization. Only a structure that hinted at careful planning, intention, and survival in a world ruled by extreme cold. And when scientists finally tested its age, the meaning of the discovery became impossible to overlook. The structure that shouldn't exist. Deep inside a limestone cave in Greece, the stones came into view while excavations were already in progress. Sediment had been removed slowly and methodically for years, when researchers began to sense that something wasn't right. This was not the result of a natural collapse, nor material carried in by flowing water. The stones were arranged too deliberately, too evenly. They formed a partial barrier near the cave's entrance, placed in a way that instantly raised questions no one was prepared to face. At that point, no one was thinking about pyramids or timelines that could rewrite human history. The concern was far more basic and far more disturbing. Why would anyone build something in a place like this? The cave itself had always been exceptional. Evidence of human presence reached further back than at most European sites. Fires have been lit here again and again over thousands of years. Footprints were preserved in soft sediment from a time long before written history. People had returned to this cave repeatedly, even as climates changed and conditions outside became harsher. Whatever this place offered, it was valuable enough to keep drawing humans back. And now there was this wall. It didn't completely seal the entrance. Instead, it narrowed it just enough to alter how air moved through the cave. Anyone standing there could sense the difference. The space behind the stones felt more stable, more protected. That detail was critical, especially when viewed against the conditions that existed when these layers of rock were formed. This was not a mild environment. Cold ruled much of Europe, and survival depended on understanding the land with precision. Mistakes could be fatal. The positioning of the stones pointed to experience, not chance. Someone had learned how this cave functioned, how wind flowed through it, how cold air invaded, and how that flow could be controlled. Even so, suggesting intentional design felt risky. Claims like that require evidence. They require context. And most of all, they require restraint. So the team did what archaeologists are trained to do. They slowed their pace. Every surrounding layer was carefully recorded. Each grain of sediment was examined. The wall was not immediately labeled a discovery. It was treated as a problem to be solved, a question that refused to disappear. Because if those stones had truly been placed by human hands, then the timeline of when humans first began shaping their environment would have to be reconsidered. And this cave might contain far more than anyone had ever expected. What emerged next, deeper within the cave's long history, would begin to reveal why this wall was built at all. A place older than memory. A human-built structure that predates the pyramids can only make sense if the place where it stands is even more ancient. That is exactly what makes Theopetra Cave so remarkable. Long before archaeologists began questioning the stones near its entrance, this cave was already recognized as one of the richest and deepest records of human life in Europe. Layer after layer, it preserves something most archaeological sites lose over time: continuity. Not a single frozen moment, but an ongoing story of people adapting, leaving, returning, and adapting once again. The cave lies in Thessaly, carved into limestone cliffs that remain almost unchanged while the world around them transforms. Inside, sediment accumulated slowly, sometimes quietly, sometimes through violent events. Fires were lit and later abandoned. Floodwaters swept through, sealing entire chapters of history beneath thick layers of silt. Each layer captured a moment shaped by human choice. When excavations began decades ago, the first discoveries were not buildings, but signs of presence. Stone tools from multiple time periods emerged. Hearts revealed repeated use. Shelled jewelry suggested personal identity and expression. Then came the footprints. Children's footprints pressed into soft ground more than 130,000 years ago, most likely left by Neanderthals. As researchers moved upward to the layers, the picture grew more complex. Evidence pointed to gradual changes in diet over time. Early inhabitants depended largely on wild plants and animals, while later layers revealed barley, wheat, olives, and a wider range of meat. These shifts did not happen suddenly. They developed slowly, showing long-term experimentation rather than rapid change. The same environment supported human life for tens of thousands of years. Burial practices appeared as well. 5 human skeletons from different periods were uncovered, including one dating to around 15,000 years ago. That single burial placed Theopetra among the earliest known modern human graves in the region. Climate changes were recorded too. Micromorphological studies revealed alternating cold and warm periods preserved within the sediment itself. One major flood deposited material more than 2 meters above the current cave floor, sealing earlier layers like pages closed inside a book. Every environmental shift demanded adaptation, and every adaptation left evidence behind. This broader context was crucial because it changed how the stones near the entrance were understood. They were not isolated or random. They fit into a long history of people responding to environmental pressure with practical solutions. The cave had never been just a shelter. It was a system that humans learned to understand and use. Archaeologists began to realize that if a structure truly existed here, it could not have been accidental or temporary. It would have been part of a survival strategy developed and refined across generations. And the deeper they explored the cave's past, the clearer one truth became. There came a time when the conditions outside grew so harsh that simply living inside the cave was no longer enough. Something needed to change. That moment would not be revealed by scattered tools or artifacts, but by the climate itself, during the coldest period humans ever experienced in Europe, when survival became design. A structure built 17,000 years before the pyramids could only appear in conditions so severe that survival itself forced people to innovate. That moment came during the last glacial maximum, the coldest phase of the Ice Age. Much of Europe was buried under ice, while exposed land became dry, brutal, and unforgiving. Even in southern areas like Greece, temperatures fell sharply. Winds grew stronger. Food sources became scarce. A cave that once provided safety could suddenly turn into a dangerous place. Cold air does not slowly drift into a cave. It rushes in. It pours through the entrance, settles along the ground, and pulls heat from everything it touches. Fires become difficult to maintain. Bodies lose warmth. Over time, the inside of the cave can feel almost as hostile as the world outside. For people living on the edge of survival, this was not an abstract idea. It was something they experienced every day. As archaeologists studied Theopetra, they began reconstructing how the cave behaved during winter. The shape of the entrance, the angle of the floor, and the way air would have flowed inside all led to the same conclusion. The cave was exposed. Anyone staying there during long periods of extreme cold would have felt its effects immediately and severely. This is the point where the stones near the entrance stopped seeming unusual and began to look essential. The barrier was placed exactly where freezing drafts would have surged inside. It did not close the cave entirely. Doing so would have trapped smoke and made the space unlivable. Instead, it narrowed the opening, limiting airflow while still allowing ventilation. It was a small change, but one with powerful results. Behind the stones, the atmosphere of the cave changed. Fires burned longer. Warmth remained trapped inside. The space shifted from a short-term shelter into something closer to a winter home. There was nothing symbolic about this solution. No carvings, no decoration, no signs of ritual. The wall was built using rough limestone rocks held together with clay, all taken from the surrounding environment. Its goal was simple and practical: block the cold and preserve heat. What makes this moment so important is not just the wall itself, but the thinking behind it. Someone identified the problem. Someone understood how the cave functioned. And someone realized that changing the environment was the solution. That realization marks a turning point. The people who built this barrier were using knowledge gained through repeated observation and shared memory. How the wind behaved when the cold was strongest, and where the cave had failed them before. This kind of response comes from experience, repetition, and cooperation. Still, despite all this evidence, Archaeologists were careful not to jump to conclusions. A structure like this, if proven intentional, would push the origins of architectural planning far deeper into the past than expected. Such claims require more than reasonable explanations. They demand careful testing, patience, and proof. Because of this, attention shifted away from the wall itself and toward the sediment surrounding it. If the structure truly dated back to the Ice Age, the layers of earth around it would reveal the truth. And when scientists finally began to ask how old the wall really was, the answers would have implications that reached far beyond a single cave built in the Ice Age. To finally answer the question archaeologists have been circling for years, they shifted their focus away from the stones themselves and examined the sediments surrounding them. Organic remains were rare and unreliable at such an ancient depth, meaning traditional radiocarbon dating had clear limits. Instead, scientists turned to thermoluminescence, a method perfectly suited for situations like this. Certain minerals store energy when exposed to heat or natural radiation. Once these minerals are buried and left undisturbed, that energy slowly builds up over time. When a sample is reheated in a laboratory, the stored energy is released as light. The stronger the light, the longer the material has remained buried. By measuring this glow, researchers can determine when the sediment was last exposed. Samples were collected from the wall itself, as well as from the layers that locked it into place. The results showed a clear pattern. Repeated tests pointed to the same time frame, approximately 23,000 years ago. That date carries major significance. It places the structure deep within the Ice Age, during the last glacial maximum, the coldest period of the entire Pleistocene epoch. Massive ice sheets dominated northern Europe. Winds swept across open land with greater force. Even areas far from the glaciers endured long-lasting cold and extreme dryness. It also places the wall nearly 17,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt were constructed. This comparison wasn't made for dramatic effect. It was simply a matter of chronology. By the time the pyramids rose, humans had already been shaping and modifying their environments for tens of thousands of years. The wall itself reflected this reality. Built during the Ice Age, it was made from rough limestone stones gathered directly from the surrounding area and held together with clay. There was no effort to polish the rocks or arrange them in perfect symmetry. Every choice was practical. The structure narrowed the cave's entrance instead of sealing it completely, allowing smoke from hearth fires to escape, while greatly reducing the flow of freezing air inside. Behind the wall, the cave would have felt noticeably different, warmer, more stable, and safer. The wall served a single purpose: survival. The importance of this realization was highlighted by Dr. Catherine Kiparissi Apostolica, who had been excavating Theopetra Cave since 1987. She explained that the structure represents an early form of architectural planning and shows that Upper Paleolithic humans were capable of far more sophisticated environmental modification than previously believed. This interpretation mattered because of the site itself. Theopetra was not a temporary shelter used briefly and then abandoned. It preserves more than 130,000 years of human presence. Neanderthals lived there. Modern humans returned to it repeatedly. Fires burned there for millennia. Tools, footprints, burials, and food remains accumulated layer upon layer, each sealed by time. The wall fit into a long tradition of adaptation. Unlike later monuments, this structure did not represent power, belief, or social order. It represented foresight. Someone understood that merely enduring the environment was no longer enough. The environment itself had to be changed. This distinction may seem small, but it is deeply significant. Modifying a living space requires planning. It requires an understanding of cause and effect. It requires cooperation because no single individual builds a wall alone. And it requires knowledge to be shared. How wind moves, where cold gathers, and how heat escapes. In other words, it marks a new way humans related to their surroundings. At this point, the discovery stopped being simply impressive and became deeply challenging. A structure this ancient didn't just extend the timeline. It questioned assumptions archaeologists had held for generations. If Ice Age humans were already planning, building, and reshaping their environment with such intention, then architecture did not begin with civilization. Instead, Civilization may have grown out of behaviors that were already well established long before cities, agriculture, or written history existed. Comparisons to the pyramids are unavoidable, but they can also be misleading. The pyramids required centralized power, surplus resources, and massive labor forces. The wall at Theopetra required none of these. It depended only on observation, experience, locally available materials, and the decision to act on what had been learned. This makes the discovery more thought-provoking than monumental. It suggests that the true origins of architecture lie not in temples or tombs, but in moments of pressure, when survival itself demanded creativity. Yet the significance of the wall does not end with its age or function. Once archaeologists accepted that Ice Age humans could deliberately reshape their environment, a new question emerged. If people were already building for warmth and stability during the harshest climate in human history, what happened when those conditions began to ease? Because when the cold slowly started to retreat, life inside Theopetra did not simply return to its earlier form. Something new began to develop. After the wall. Once archaeologists accepted that the wall was deliberately built and dated to the Ice Age, their focus shifted to what happened afterward. The structure solved an immediate problem, but also marked a major turning point. Life inside Theopetra did not remain the same once the wall existed. The layers above it reveal a story of adaptation, testing new ideas in slow but steady change. As the harshest phase of the Ice Age began to ease, people continued using the cave. However, the way they lived inside it started to evolve. Archaeological evidence shows that inhabitants did not abandon the cave when conditions improved. Instead, they adjusted their behavior once again, building upon the knowledge they had already gained. Diet provides one of the clearest signs of this shift. Earlier layers show a strong dependence on wild resources obtained through hunting and gathering. Later layers, however, contain traces of barley, wheat, olives, and a wider variety of animal meat. These findings do not yet point to full agriculture, but they do suggest more advanced survival strategies. People were expanding their diets, testing new food sources, and managing resources with greater care. Evidence of food storage also appears. Hearths become more organized. Areas within the cave take on clearer functions. These changes indicate that people were staying longer, returning more often, and arranging their living space with greater intention. The cave was no longer just a temporary shelter from the cold. It was becoming a reliable home base. Burial practices further support this idea. 5 human skeletons from different periods were discovered inside Theopetra Cave. One burial, dated to around 15,000 years ago, is especially significant as one of the earliest known modern human burials in the region. This was not an abandoned body. It was a purposeful burial, showing that the cave held meaning beyond basic survival. Micromorphological studies of the cave's sediments add another important detail. Researchers identified layers showing alternating cold and warm periods, along with evidence of a major flood that deposited sediment more than 2 meters above the present cave floor. Despite dramatic environmental changes, both the cave and its inhabitants endured. What begins to take shape is an image of early humans as careful planners who responded to change step by step. The wall was only one solution among many, and it may represent one of the earliest moments when humans actively reshaped their environment. This is important because it challenges a long-held belief in archaeology. For many years, complex planning and environmental modification were linked mainly to farming societies. Theopetra disrupts that idea, showing that the foundations of these behaviors reach far deeper into the Paleolithic, long before villages, agriculture, or permanent fields existed. The wall did not create civilization, but it created stability, and stability changes the way people think. When a place becomes warmer, safer, and more predictable, people can plan beyond immediate survival. They can store food, they can bury their dead, they can return to the same location again and again, confident that it will continue to protect them. The wall marked the beginning of a slow transformation in how humans related to space, resources, and one another. It was a quiet, practical solution that opened the path to much larger changes in the future. Yet when people discuss the origins of building, structures like this are often overlooked. Instead, attention is given to grand monuments. In the end, The question archaeologists were left asking was not simply how old the wall was, but why discoveries like this are so easy to miss. If a simple structure could survive for 23,000 years and still change how we understand early humans, what other chapters of the story might still be missing? Before monuments. For tens of thousands of years, humans survived by moving. When conditions became difficult, they followed animals, water sources, and seasonal changes. But the wall represents something different. It marks the moment when adaptation turned inward. Instead of escaping a harsh environment, people chose to reshape it. That decision had lasting consequences. Once humans began altering their surroundings, even in simple ways, their relationship with the world changed. Space became something that could be controlled, improved, and depended upon. Survival was no longer based only on endurance. It began to rely on planning. Theopetra reveals this shift in its most practical form. The wall created a small advantage, slightly more warmth, slightly more stability, enough to endure another winter, enough to come back again. From that point on, everything else becomes easier to imagine. Food can be stored when a space remains usable. Tools can be left behind when people expect a return. Burials can occur when a place holds meaning beyond short-term shelter. None of these behaviors require farming or cities. They only require continuity. The cave provided that continuity for more than 130,000 years. Neanderthals lived there. Modern humans returned to it. Climate cycles reshaped the landscape. Floods sealed sections of the cave. And still, people kept coming back. The wall fits into this story not as a sudden breakthrough, but as a necessary response. It was built because the environment demanded it, and it succeeded. This changes how early human intelligence is understood. Innovation did not suddenly appear with agriculture or organized belief systems. It developed slowly, under pressure, through observation, cooperation, and experience. The abilities needed to build the pyramids were not created overnight. They were formed step by step, long before anyone imagined stacking stone toward the sky. The wall at Theopetra represents one of those early steps. It also exposes a deeper issue in how history is remembered. Archaeology often highlights what survives in obvious ways: stone temples and massive ruins. Structures like this wall are easy to overlook. If it had collapsed or if erosion had erased it, the intention and behavior behind it would be invisible. This leads to an intriguing possibility. The wall may not be unique. It may simply be rare in its preservation. Early humans likely altered caves, shelters, and living spaces in many ways that left little lasting evidence. Most of those traces have disappeared. Theopetra survived by chance, protected by geology and time. Because of that survival, we are given a rare glimpse into a phase of human life that usually escapes the record, a time when architecture existed without ceremony and building directly served survival. In this sense, the wall is not a competitor to the pyramids. It is their ancestor, not in shape, but in mindset. Before humans built monuments for gods and kings, they built protection for their families. Before architecture became a symbol, it was a solution. The wall at Theopetra represents that original purpose. It reminds us that human progress is not always marked by grand achievements. Sometimes it begins on a much smaller scale, in the choice to place stones where cold wind once rushed in, and in the quiet realization that the world could be shaped, even slightly, to work in our favor. And it suggests that the foundations of civilization were laid long before civilization had a name. If humans were already reshaping their environment during the Ice Age, how many other early structures might have existed but left no trace behind? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.